census records, several official letters detailing his alleged misdeeds, as well as some reminiscences. And all these are settler documents. Thus, any attempt to understand his motives and thoughts must necessarily be tentative. Also, as a non-Indigenous person, a settler, I am far from the best person to speculate on the motivations which drove his life. Nevertheless, there is value in making some educated guesses about Guldy's thought processes, not least so that his remarkable life remains known, hopefully to be rediscovered and reinterpreted by Indigenous scholars. So on the 18th of February 1826, the New South Wales newspaper, the Sydney Gazette, entertained its readers with a satirical letter to the editor. And the writer, a certain Dr. Wigwam, referred in this letter, in passing, to the sable Mr. Devil, who at present, I believe, is in the Sydney jail, and who, by the way, is not cloven-footed, but bumble-footed. While Dr. Wigwam was clearly a pseudonym, the name of his subject, Mr. Devil, was not, at least not strictly speaking, because this was one of the popular names by which Guldy was known. Both Aboriginal people and settlers had given him the name Devil because they greatly feared him, but he was also called Bumblefoot, or simply Bumble, because of a deformity in which his toes were folded back onto the instep, a characteristic which made him clearly and easily recognised. Now, nothing is known of Guldy's early life, but he burst into prominence, at least in the written records, when in his late 20s, and in 1824, he was reported as almost beheading a convict named Jeremiah Buffy in the bush near what is today Swansea, an outer suburb of Newcastle. The motive for the attack, according to a report in the Australian newspaper at least, was to rob the victim of firearms and provisions. The man was so badly injured that he was left for dead, but he miraculously survived and made his way back to Newcastle, so that Guldy became the talk of that region. Arrested within months by a district constable on the Hawkesbury River, in 1825, Guldy became the first Aboriginal man to come before the New South Wales Supreme Court, and this was less than 12 months after it was created. It was here that Guldy was able to take advantage of several weaknesses in the colonial system, whether intentionally or not, we don't know, of course. For example, the Supreme Court was unclear as to whether it had any jurisdiction over Aboriginal people, and if it did, under what circumstances they could be tried. Thus, an initial charge, probably we imagine of attempted murder, was dropped. Chief Justice Forbes ruling that the case could not proceed, since Guldy spoke no English and no interpreter was present. In this early period, Indigenous people were only judged amenable to the laws of England if there was sufficient means of interpreting the proceedings of the court. But this technical loophole masked a much deeper uncertainty about the imposition of settler sovereignty over Aboriginal people, which was only resolved about 11 years later, when Justice Burton, speaking for the whole bench, said that although it's granted that Aboriginal people in New Holland are entitled to be regarded by civilised nations as a free and independent people, yet they don't have a sufficient organisation to be governed by their own laws, and so they must be governed by ours. In short, Aboriginal people had no sovereignty over their own country and could therefore be tried under British law. As Lisa Ford has pointed out, the ruling conflated three different concepts: sovereignty, territory, and jurisdiction, such that Aboriginal people found themselves not just living on invaded land, but required to obey the invaders' laws. This would later have serious implications for Indigenous rights, but had not yet been fully articulated in 1825 when Guldy was tried. The case was probably also weak because the victim, Jeremiah, had in fact recovered. It was more reasonable that some months later, Guldy appeared again before the Supreme Court, this time on the lesser charge of violent assault. And following this second appearance, Guldy was found guilty, but he wasn't sentenced because the judge probably hoped that the experience of being in Sydney jail would by itself deter him from further attacks. But this ruling exposed yet another weakness in the colonial system, because the governor, who was Ralph Darling at the time, was so angry with what the court had done that he ordered that Buffy should receive a ticket of leave in recompense, that is, that he should be freed from servitude. So whatever the judge's hopes had been, 3 years later in 1828, Guldy was again inciting terror, but this time within the context of the Indigenous legal system. An Aboriginal woman who was at Lake Macquarie, south of Newcastle, told missionary Lancelot Threlkeld that Guldy and a companion were planning to tie her to a tree, spear her to death, roast her, and then eat her in revenge for the death of her husband. The missionary, Threlkeld, then intervened on the woman's behalf, and he threatened that he would request Governor Darling to cease handouts and employment for Aboriginal people if they did kill the woman. And when Guldy heard about what Threlkeld had said, he then threatened to kill Threlkeld as well. So here, Guldy's intention seems to have been to frighten at least the woman, but it's also possible that he relied on the colonial system in that he foresaw that Threlkeld would step in, and so that although he'd made these threats, he wouldn't have to carry them out, and in fact he would avoid being incarcerated a second time. And then just 2 years later, in 1830, Guldy was reported as being the head of a group committing some most daring and atrocious depredations, that is, farm raids on the Central Coast. It's clear that by this time, the settlers were quite in awe of him. The Gazette, which was a newspaper, reported admiringly that from his warlike threats and known ferocious character, the persons residing on the spot have been deterred from pursuing him. And the Australian newspaper predicted that Bumble will beat the police hollow. And this was true. He wasn't captured, despite a constable being sent to the district. And when arrests were made later, Guldy was conspicuous by his absence. So this makes clear again that Guldy was capitalising on one of the weakest points of colonial governance, the difficulty of policing a remote, underpopulated backwater, because that's what the Central Coast was at this time. So from all that, it might be anticipated that Guldy died a violent death, but such is not the case. Somewhere in middle life, he appears to have resigned himself to the settlers' de facto conquest of Darkinjung land, and he submitted himself to their patronage. Settler reminiscences record that he spent his latter years living with his wife on a farm in the Yarramalong Valley, that's on the map, on the Central Coast, and almost became the so-called last of his tribe for that district. And although there are several conflicting accounts of his death, the most reliable records are that he fell from a tree, aged in his 70s, while climbing it for honey. And the name Bumble, which was his name, is perpetuated in a hill and several creeks, all located near the place where he died. So Guldy's life story significantly subverts the standard narratives of Aboriginal resistance. Guldy stands out as a forceful, threatening figure. It would be easy to argue that he was driven to his various acts of violence by a desire to avenge settler expropriation of Darkinjung land and other injustices. But closer examination of his life suggests perhaps more nuanced motives. His near murder of the settler, the convict near Swansea, seems to have been opportunistic, while his attack on the woman near Threlkeld's mission appears to be a response to Indigenous law requiring payback for a suspicious death. His preference for operating alone or in small groups, too, argues against his actions being the considered will of the Darkinjung people to whom he belonged. And so we can say that it seems quite possible that the alienation and humiliation that he had received and experienced because of his deformity may have embittered his attitude towards humankind in general. The Gazette's horrified admiration for his warlike threats and known ferocious character invite comparisons with other colonial outlaws who were in fact settlers, whose actions may be interpreted not so much as part of a considered plan of resistance, but as flamboyant and reckless gestures against colonial power, designed to demonstrate fearless personal defiance of the world in the face of circumstances which were far beyond the subject's control. Thank you.
Thanks, Laurie. I'm sure Lara will come online in just a second.
Thanks a lot, Laurie, for that. Really interesting talk there. Really interesting idea about that you sort of touched on towards the end there about whether resistance is always a collective action,
yes,
or whether, you know, these sorts of isolated sort of freebooter or outlaw actions can be read as resistance, or whether we should frame them as something else.
Yes,
and some great and interesting biographical information there. So thank you very much for that. Okay, we'll have the next speaker, please, which is Amanda.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. And just first, thanks to Laura and Michael as conveners here. And also I apologize for missing the first few conversations this morning. I understand from Slack that they are incredibly rich, but the time difference was bigger than I was. But hopefully everybody can hear me okay. I'm not working with slides, so I'm just gonna sort of, great, yeah, I'm just gonna launch in here. So today I'd like to talk about the prospectus of an article that thinks about connections between effectively different imperial controversies or sort of different imperial forms in the mid-19th century. It's thinking about the connections between the long infamous Governor Eyre controversy over imperial brutality in Jamaica, circa 1865, when the Morant Bay Rebellion occurred and the repressions took place, which carried on for a couple of years, but really sort of met its death throes in the early 1870s. It's taking that in relation to the roughly contemporaneous British reactions to the ascendancy of extra legality and what was called vigilantism in California and the wider North American Pacific. At its heart, this project, as I see it expressing itself through an article, is concerned with how we think about the mid-19th century trajectory of the British Empire and the sub-empires that it effectively bestrode, and how the role and development of British, or indeed specifically English, things that were explicitly designated as English, how these moral and political logics emerged and were contested in a wider imperial context. To this end, the article is going to interrogate our assumptions about things that we call authoritarian or supposedly self-governing or settler imperial turns. And it's going to compare contemporaneous debates about states of exception within supposedly, supposedly legalistic, supposedly Anglo-Saxon processes of imperial expansion and consolidation. So I should add the caveat now that while I drew up my proposal on the material that I wanted to bring to you all in February, I anticipated doing substantial archival research that I think we could say for many of us has fallen by the wayside in the last 6 months or has proven a temporary impossibility. So although archival research plans for this project have been on hold for the past half year, I still really wanted to take the underlying concerns and problems of this piece to you as a group. So I do apologize. What follows is going to be a bit impressionistic, but I really thank you in advance for your indulgence and for your insights on the core problems and for some suggestions then on project design going forward. Effectively, to set the scene, or sort of to give you a synopsis of where I think I'm going. The Morant Bay Revolt of October 1865, and then the subsequent firestorm in Britain over Governor Edward Eyre's brutal suppression, is the subject of extensive research. It's a pivotal episode in effectively some of the greatest hits of New Imperial history, of really the foundational works in New Imperial history, and also works on liberal imperial political economy from the 1990s through the 2000s. It's central to Thomas Holt's study of the failures of liberal political economy in post-emancipation Jamaica. It's a central sort of component of actually several field-defining essays by Catherine Hall. And it's very prominent in Karuna Montana's autopsy of mid-Victorian liberal imperialism and its afterlives. That said, given the sort of the interest that I have here in the legal issues at hand, the best treatment of the legal character of the Eyre affair comes from Randy Costall's Jurisprudence of Power, as Costall examines British reactions to Eyre's imposition of martial law and the summary execution of mixed-race civic leader George Gordon, and then the permanent dissolution of colonial self-government. For us, Costall really helpfully breaks things down. In his words, liberals and radicals were attracted to the Jamaica case because they saw the suppression, and more particularly the unwillingness of conservatives to condemn the suppression, as evidence of a resurgent authoritarianism in English politics, end quote. That said, this leads me to another starting point. Why, despite this outcry over authoritarianism, did successive attempts to convict Eyre of murder in Britain not only fail, but lose their public traction? Why did concern about abuse of power and rule of law dim? Why did a widening segment of British opinion move to the position that extra-legal measures were effectively a crucial recognition of the extraordinary requirements in an expanding imperial world? Hall and Holt largely attribute this shift to the hardening of racial ideology in Britain that increasingly held non-white subjects as unimprovable and irredeemably other, and that believed good governance hinged on the recognition that subject populations were just too backward, childlike, or treacherous for so-called English protections to obtain. While embracing these core insights, I suggest there are two ways of critiquing and extending the problem. First, I'm going to propose that an emphasis on the other, and the other as an exclusion from an English we, presumes a national or a national/imperial repertoire, and a reactionary defensiveness that doesn't seem to me sufficiently creative, constructive, or what we might consider positive in its content, especially given the broader chaos of the world Britain supposedly bestrode at mid-century. In the 1850s and 60s, the so-called subject empire was contested, but so too were private and public approaches to settler colonialism, which outpaced the general conservatism of the imperial state. Violent settler incursions led to endemic conflict, as many here know, endemic conflict in Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and South Africa. The aftermath of gold rushes heightened the stakes for the imposition of authoritarian order. Measures introducing self-government then, such as Lord Carnarvon's Confederation of Canada in 1867, just to take the headliner here, these dressed conservative, both as a sort of a party-led but also programmatic approach, conservative and Anglo-chauvinist ends in constitutional robes. The problem, I think, is how is any of this actually galvanizing and bracing? How is this the kind of stuff that historians tend to fold into what they call the age of high Victorian liberal optimism? This thing that suffused a supposed age of equipoise as Britain contemplated its prospects at home and abroad. So this leads to my second nudge beyond the picture that I really appreciate, which is of an Englishness defined in blunt opposition to uncivilized or dependent others. Opposition and othering should, I think, have more dynamic positional and aspirational components. The line between settler, colonial, and subject empire should be blurred. The scope should be widened to take in what was feeding contemporaries' understanding of world affairs at the time. So to start to do this, I propose we need to appreciate how two generations of radicals and liberals at the heart of the air affair stemming from his misrule in Jamaica, effectively, we need to see them in a new light. We need to see how they reacted, but really try to put them in their moment in the 1860s and understand it more broadly, and in fact, come to it with a new lens. We come on the fascinating problem when we compare their views on Jamaica with air's brutality, when we compare those views to their contemporaneous interpretations of developments in what they were then calling the newest of new worlds. And here I'm talking about the North American Pacific. While most studies of imperial ideologies have focused within the territorial bounds of the British Empire, mid-Victorians were far less concerned with formal jurisdiction. They saw civilizational forces and essences expressing themselves through riotous mobilities and confrontations. The explosion of wealth and population on the North American Pacific in the years following the Californian gold rush was one instance. And for a time, some British commentators held this phenomenon to be as relevant to England's global story as anything happening in Australia or Canada. Why the air controversy fizzled out in Britain certainly involves the radical conservative embrace of the heroic strongman and a wider conviction that the rule of law depended on the discretion of what, you know, again, we're framed as world historical leaders or world historical sort of despots. And here in that framing, their actions were righteous. But I do not think that we could ignore the now strange seeming ambivalence of radical liberals, not conservatives, but liberals, when it came to rule of law in colonial and frontier contexts, even those who wholeheartedly subscribed to the air prosecution effort. This is something that I first noticed when going through radical liberal Charles Dilke's papers in the British Library. I was looking for correspondence regarding Dilke's era-defining 1868 round-the-world travelogue, which he had titled Greater Britain. I was coming up empty-handed about Greater Britain because Dilke's archive, you know, precocious though he was, it really began with his sort of ascendant parliamentary career from from about 1870 onward. And yet the Dilke I knew from Greater Britain, again published just 2 years before 1870, it seems so different from the Dilke whose earliest papers mentioned his commitment to prosecuting air. How could I reconcile these two Dilkes? How could this same Dilke, whose political principles abhorred summary execution and the imposition of martial law in Jamaica, have been a leading prophet of, wait for it, summary execution and the imposition of martial law in San Francisco? You know, again, but in this case, justified in terms of the supposed self-governing genius of Anglo-Saxons from ancient times to the present. I do have a sketch of how I think that worked for Dilke and how I might apply this and how we might take this forward to think about this in a sort of a larger generational sense. Dilke wrote in his analysis of Californian affairs in Greater Britain, his 1868 travelogue, that Englishness, in his words, was finally fully seeing a new day. Timeless racial features appeared transplanted to a beautiful place and future. California was, quote, Saxon only in the looks and language of the people of its towns. In California, though, you are at last in a new world, end quote. In the same context, he also wrote about extirpation, saying that Westward movement proved that the Anglo-Saxons were the only extirpating race. But what of all this? Looking at the frontier and at the racial alchemy of the North American Pacific frontier as it emerged from the 1850s, Dilke invoked a new narrative of decisive self-government around what he was happily calling lynch law. Literally, these are his words, lynch law. Lynch law, so the story went, sprang up through so-called vigilance committees formed by American-born, British, German, and Scandinavian groups as they conducted roundups and hangings. Again, extrajudicial hangings of known or suspected criminals and gang members. And their first victims were initially those infamous Australians, the Sydney Ducks in San Francisco. The most prominent episodes occurred in 1851 and 1856. and quickly entered into then contemporary legend. So I'm talking about how immediate sort of legend or contemporary history is processed into the 1860s. What sounds or what might sound like mob rule to us was anything but that to Dilke, who saw the timeless genius of the Anglo-Saxon moot in the vigilantes' pursuit of justice against corruption and civic misrule. To give you a flavor, let me just throw a few quotes here. He says, "Democracy has never endured so rough a test as that from which it has triumphantly emerged in the Golden State and City. In the merchant founders of the Vigilance Committee of San Francisco, we can see the descendants of the justice-loving Germans of the time of Tacitus. I found in another class of vigilance the moral offspring of Alfred's village aldermen of our own Saxon age. At San Jose, I heard the details of Southern's custom law, the Californian Grand Coutumier it might be called, which convinced me that in order to find the rudiments of all that politically speaking is best and most vigorous in the Saxon mind, you must see countries in which Saxon civilization is itself in its infancy." And so through Dilke, we see that the totem of settler self-government, frontier justice, and the prerogative of the man on the ground, this is how the Californian spectacle contributed to and supercharged these discourses in British public debate, albeit in varying forms and arenas from the 1860s onward. And I think I have just about a minute to bring me to my 15 minutes of your time. So I just want to basically propose a strange seeming contradiction. It's that, of course, this is sort of a claim for rogue action. Even in the pursuit of nominal justice, it was never unanimous. But the emphasis and sort of freakishly positive tone struck by Dilke, looking out at what we're calling vigilantism here, found ample resonance. Various other celebrity chroniclers were repeating these lines, and it was across the spectrum, conservative through liberal. All this could seem kind of like momentary or quaint, if not for the fact that these views were shared or entertained by an older generation of radicals split into the opposed camps we recognize by the mid-century as liberal or conservative, but who found themselves headlining the different sides of the heir controversy. John Stuart Mill, the head of the Jamaica Committee, was, like Gladstone, famously mesmerized by Dilke's description of Greater Britain and its social and political possibilities. In fact, Mill became a patron of Dilke until Mill's death in 1873. But sort of on the other side, we have the author, we could say a literary historian, and erstwhile Christian socialist Charles Kingsley, who was once a radical of Mill's ilk, who fell in squarely with the Heir Defense Committee. Now, scholars have noted Kingsley's descent into instinctual conservatism and a hardline biological racism by the 1850s. But Kingsley's support of Eyre was, in some key aspects, more resonant with his essentialist sort of historical imagination and the novels that he'd written previously, namely Westward Ho, in which he proclaimed the eternal disposition of the English race toward colonial expansion driven by the beacon of the sun in the west, seeing from the Tudor era the, quote, golden dream, and hailing the seamanship, the science, the chivalry, the heroism. It is bound up in the heart of man, that longing for the west, end quote. While cloying, I don't think we can dismiss the symmetry between Kingsley's prose and the later stylings of Dilke in heralding the English pursuit of the furthest west, chasing the sunset, and supposedly finally then coming into its glory, the younger man having read the elder and then translating and transforming the idiom. There's some delicious sort of afterlives to sort of the confrontation that comes out of the Eyre affair, and to really hear Kingsley and the way that he becomes some ways a pawn in the larger unfolding, and how he doesn't actually satisfy either side of the debate. He himself accidentally welcoming Eyre back to England in Southampton in 1866, saying that Eyre had the English spirit of indomitable perseverance, courage, and adventure, but also admitting that he himself didn't really have a very good understanding of what had gone on in Jamaica. He was simply celebrating Eyre as one of these sort of Tudor adventurers. And I'd love to get more into that there, but just to sum up and to hand it over to then, to the next colleague here, I do want to propose that there are two seemingly disparate phenomena in mid-Victorian politics and celebrity legalism that I am going to be looking at as I go forward with this research. One well-known, another far less commonplace. But in their tense coexistence or really interplay, reveal the wider sources and stakes of mid-Victorian imperial worldviews, and crucial, if previously unrecognized, elements in the construction of Englishness. The Jamaica controversy we know a great deal about. British readings of vigilantism in the North American Pacific after the first major gold rush, less so. But taken together, both suggest how liberal and conservative ideologies, born of earlier radicalism, could accommodate the abrogation of law as an essential prerogative of a still avowedly legal and an ultra-legal Englishness. The discretion and boldness to abrogate, in fact, underpinned the vigor and robustness of the law in this rendering. And thank you again, Laura. I will let you take it from there.
Thank you. Very rich paper there. I think lots of the Victorianist literary scholars will probably have a few things to say about Kingsley as well. I know lots of them are here today. And also perhaps scholars of humanitarianism, which is another area, of course, where these contradictions between seemingly radical liberalism and, a move towards authoritarianism and extrajudicial forms of imperial control is finding very fruitful expression, as you well know. So hopefully lots of rich stuff to have and lots of rich conversations to have there in the questions. Okay, great. Now we're, okay, final presentation for this session, Weiao.
Okay, hello. I just started my video. Sorry, I have to share my screen here. Okay, so can you see my slideshow?
Yeah, yep, we can see it.
Okay, so it's correct. Okay, so hello everybody. After talking about the colonial and indigenous history in the 19th centuries with other panelists, let's move a little bit further to the 17th and early 18th centuries. My presentation today is a kind of methodological paper, so it won't focus on particular historical cases. Instead, I'm trying to talk about methods and historiography about multilingualism and counter-translation. European colonization in the New World has long been the object of inquiry among early modernists and early Americanists. In recent years, relevant historical research has been shaped by the encounters and the framework of Atlantic history in an interactive way, indicating a tendency moving from missionary and colonial history to Atlantic, connective, and global history. So in this paper, I'm trying to test the potential of two notions, multilingualism and counter-translation, that are usually used by scholars of literature in a kind of framework of social and cultural history of encounters in the early modern Atlantic world. Okay, so the first thing is about multilingualism. It is a widely discussed concept among scholars working on linguistic issues in contemporary societies. So if you have friends working in the Department of Education or Social Linguistics, you may heard about this notion frequently. The coexistence of diverse languages is far from unique to our current world. This phenomenon is shaped by the language contact from circulations in the past, and meanwhile forms historical exchanges and encounters among individuals across speech communities. And here are a few historians working on early modern multilingualism within Europe or across boundaries. In the early modern period, the formation and evolution of multilingualism require a long-term process of interaction, accumulation, and diffusion, especially in interregional encounters. Multilingualism in early modern colonization, for example, was triggered by language contact, demographic change, and further cross-linguistic and intercultural exchanges in colonial context zones. In the initial phase of encounters, this effortful process indeed took time, considering the lack of dictionaries, translators, and educational sources that are normally taken for granted in cross-cultural communication nowadays. As for multilingual encounters in colonial North America, Edward Gray analyzes the multiplicity of Amerindian languages and intellectual attitudes towards indigenous languages and cultures in the waves of overseas missions, the Enlightenment, and the construction of the United States. Multilingualism in the New World, however, is not confined to English Amerindian encounters or French Amerindian encounters. Multilingual conversations and interactions also occurred within the Aboriginal communities, as well as French and Spanish settlements and their connections with Africans. Other European colonization is noticeable in forming these circulations as multidimensional encounters in the early modern period. Interregional multilingualism should not be narrowly regarded as the coexistence of European and indigenous languages. Here's an example. So we can see a chart which is about books published in the Northeast US, especially the New England colony at that time. According to the dataset from EBO, we can see that most of the books published was in the English language, and here quite a few numbers of them published in the Latin language in order to shed new light on some educational and religious practice. And we can also see that apart from Dutch and Spanish, these sort of European colonial languages, here lots of publications, especially Bibles and missionary works in the Amerindian languages. And we can see a photo of this one. It is a translation of the Bible by John Eliot, who studied in Cambridge in the early 17th century and immigrated to the New World as a very noticeable missionary. Okay, so I mean that in colonial encounters and overseas missions, multilingual topics are inclined to emerge from religious and intellectual perspectives. As for the case in North America, scholars have investigated the acquisition and comprehension of Native American languages by European missionaries, as well as the translation of Christian texts into indigenous discourses for educating purposes. And focusing on the multiplicity of languages and belief systems in the New World, Sarah Rivet asserts that through the practice of translating Christian texts into indigenous languages, these early Protestant and Catholic missionaries struggled to address some of the more contentious doctrinal debates of the 17th century. Intellectually, she also articulates that these multilingual sources represent the practice and the philosophy of colonization and the linguistic ways in which Amerindians mediate this uneven contact. And at both local and global levels, early modern multilingualism was born of cross-linguistic exchanges and was developed thanks to the frequent circulations driven by contemporary colonial and religious encounters connecting different regions. This concept sheds new light on textual sources in the circulation of information and knowledge. In addition, multilingualism is regarded as an agency and representation of social and cultural interactions in the early modern world. This notion, in that case, is important in illuminating facets such as orality, everyday life, and popular culture as well. So let's move to the second notion, which is cultural translation. Unlike multilingualism with a relatively clear definition, the notion of cultural translation is far from complex than its literal meaning. To understand cultural elements in source culture without direct equivalence in the target context. Instead of an explicit definition, source culture without direct instead of an explicit definition, its diversity appears in works by a series of anthropologists, historians, and scholars in translation studies and postcolonial studies, resulting in the conceptual and methodological ambiguity among themselves. So we can see that scholars at different times proposed different core notions regarding cultural translation. And then let's talk about how to use this post-colonial notion into historical research. The historicization of cultural translation is initially rooted in the interfaces of anthropology and history since the 1960s. However, in the discipline of history, this notion only frequently appears later with the rise of the global scope and the interactive approach. In the subfield of early modern history, this concept sheds new light on interregional and intercultural exchanges in terms of religious interactions. For example, historians are attempting to interpret cultural circulations from multiple aspects, converting texts, images, and objects. Meanwhile, the recent scholarship is also concerned about cultural circulations in the global network of commodities, diplomacy, and science. The origins of cultural translation may be found in post-colonial studies. This feature, however, brings about a contextual and time-related doubt in its implication. That is, directly using this post-colonial concept to examine the colonial past can be a kind of anachronistic thing. For example, emphasizing the active accommodation and negotiation of the indigenous culture in the early modern period may dilute the colonial motivations of settlers. In respect of post-colonialism, an inspiration for cultural translation is from its ethical consideration and the negotiation of difference separated from the politics of languages. Since the 1980s, scholars, including Homi Bhabha, has raised concerns about ethical issues intertwined with cultural differences and social discrimination. These questions regarding inclusion and exclusion, dignity and humiliation, respect and repudiation universally exist in the world across colonialism and post-colonialism. In colonial contexts, intercultural translations are normally unethical as they denigrate other culture and seeks to subdue, annihilate, or displace them. In other words, the colonial language becomes culturally more powerful, devaluing the native language as it is brought into its domain, domesticated and accommodated. Early modern global encounters, however, are far from the linear model of the colonizer and the colonized people. Even in colonization, a wide range of accounts on the indigenous culture indicates the so-called primitivity, anthropological nature among some settlers like Behm, who widely published descriptions about Native American communities in the 17th century New France. Another post-colonial enlightenment of cultural translation is its emphasis on the power structure of languages, as is I mean that we can see the case by Eric Schiffitz. It's quite old book, but it's still a very important study that uses the notion of translation as a storyline to talk about a very wide ranges of topics, including legal rights and foreign affairs. As such, originating in a post-colonial context, cultural translation illuminates a series of universal aspects and features like ethical issues and power distribution in intercultural encounters across time. This notion, as is applied in abundant works by the existing scholarships, opens up new perspectives in the re-examination of the colonial past, especially achieves more multi-layer interactions in the analysis on early modern global encounters. In the meantime, the use of cultural translation in colonial discourses should be cautious, elaborating the dynamic encounters between colonizers and the colonized people. It's of course not a sort of moralization and rationalization of colonialism. So in my methodological presentation, we have already talked about the kind of historical change from regional missionary or religious studies and colonial history to a much more Atlantic and connective history. And scholars are also quite interested in related issues in the Pacific world as well. As for the multilingualism, this notion purpose, we have talked about its usage in the approach of social and cultural history. So we can not only study languages that represent particular texts as important primary sources, they can also represent how did these sort of texts were produced by different people, how did they circulate across boundaries and be perceived by different people, as for both settlers and indigenous people. And the last notion is about cultural translation. It is borrowed from anthropology and post-colonial studies, and it might be useful for us to talk about particular cultural exchanges, not only as for texts, but also for material and visual culture, architectures, and so on, in order to shed new light on the colonial exchanges. And we may think that it can be a useful way for us to talk about the voice of the indigenous people as well. Okay, that is the end of my presentation. And so let's come back to Laura, and thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I mean, I think that was a really, really useful sort of synopsis of the many and varied ways in which post-colonial theory is beginning to inform histories of transatlantic encounter going back beyond the colonial. And yeah, I think this multilingualism and multilingualisms, foregrounding that in that is a really interesting intervention. So thank you for that.